This is Stand Up for the Truth, addressing important issues and topics affecting Christians across the nation.
Good morning. It's Crash Connell, October 15, 2024. A little reminder this time next week, we're going to kick off our Q Drive, our on-air fundraiser. It's only 3 days. We are listener-supported, and we're going to be seeking your support next week. But today, a fresh new podcast. Mary Danielson is here.
Yes, welcome to Stand Up. Good morning, everyone. So happy to have Pastor Chris Quintana back on the podcast. We are going to unpack the book of Psalms. Chris is winding down on his systematic teaching of that book, so I figured what a great time to look at, I think it's my favorite book of the Bible. And, while the entirety of Scriptures are living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, Hebrews 4:12, Psalms just seems to have a certain effect on me. And I would say it has been an important book in the lives of believers in all times and seasons as they walk their own pilgrimage and learn what it means to have a deeply personal relationship with Jesus. The Psalms are all about God's relationship with us and creation and Israel and the nations. So we are going to dig into that today. I'm so looking forward to this. For my passage this morning, I've chosen Psalm 32, 7 to 11 because it contains all the things that I love about the Psalms: declarations, praise, instruction, and really, I think a psalm that in totality is one of the most transparent and heartfelt passages or prayers from David himself. So Psalm 32, 7 to 11. You are my hiding place. You shall preserve me from trouble. You shall surround me with songs of deliverance. Selah. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will guide you with my eye. Do not be like the horse or like the mule, which have no understanding, which must be harnessed with bit and bridle, else they will not come near you. Many sorrows shall be to the wicked, but he who trusts in the Lord, mercy shall surround him. Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, you righteous, and shout for joy, you upright in heart. Oh Lord, you are our all in all for everything in life. Help us to comprehend that more and more with each passing day. Thank you for David and those who, by your Spirit, were directed to put pen to paper and bring us the human side of our existence, for giving us prayers by day and songs by night. We ask for an extra measure of the wisdom and understanding that is found in your word. We thank you that you have chosen us to follow you and live in the light. We are grateful beyond measure, Lord, and we long to be where you are. We ask for an increasing heart for the lost, for the suffering, and the confused. Give us compassion and grace to continue to shine the light until you call us home. We ask that you would bless Chris and his family, protect them, cause them to continually grow in grace, and lead them safely home. In Jesus' name, amen. A good friend and kindred spirit, Chris Quintana, had pastored Calvary Chapel, Cyprus, which then became Calvary Old Path from 2010 to 2020. He relocated to Texas, and now he teaches the Scriptures in an online format. Chris leads trips to Israel. I know that's dear to his heart. And he loves the Scriptures. That comes through in all of his teaching. He loves to tie it together so that we can all better know our Savior. oldpaththeology.net. Chris, welcome back to Stand Up. Great to have you back.
It's good to be back. I am so sorry. This is what happens when I'm not in studio. It has been quiet here all morning, and now my dog's going berserk because somebody knocked on the door. Probably a solicitor, so I apologize if there's all kinds of noise coming through, but it's great to be with you.
Yeah, and I can't hear that. I have not heard that. So I do want to ask you, what's new with the ministry? What books are you teaching currently? I know you're teaching more than one, so where is that at?
Well, just finished Psalm 147 last night, so I have the last three, and I'll have those next Monday. And then for Thursday this week, I start with the opening of the seventh seal, chapter 8 in the book of Revelation.
Wow, great. So you're making your way through that. That's fantastic. And I know I'm on your website here, oldpaththeology.net. /updates, and you actually have an email list. People can that's an option for people to keep up with what you're doing. So I would encourage people to do that. And I know you missed the Israel trip this year, which is hard. Sometimes I wish I was there. It doesn't matter what's going on for me. I just want to be there. Are you rescheduling that for 2025 if the Lord tarries?
We do have a tentative date. We're looking to go back on March the 10th,
Okay.
Depending on what happens, of course. We're not afraid to go either. I kind of like you. I would rather be there. But again, if there are large portions of the territory that you can't get to, that makes it kind of tough. I mean, people want to get there. For many of them, that may be the only time that they ever get there. So having to cut short a trip or
Yeah.
miss a bunch of areas, especially in the north, is just not something I'm interested in doing.
Right.
So as far as the website too, we also have a YouTube channel, which is where most people go for the studies. As it has been thus far, I've kind of kept the website is kind of my backup plan in case YouTube ever decides to go crazy.
Okay.
But we're starting to work on the website to have more traffic there, just because. In the next couple of months, you'll probably see a lot more content there. But we have both avenues ready for the studies, and we keep them in both locations.
Okay, great. And we want to focus on the book of Psalms today. And when did you begin that journey? And I want to ask you what impact it had on you personally, because I know you've taught it before, but every time I think, just as a body, go through another book, things pop out at us. We learn things. We see things we hadn't seen before. And I know teaching it is different than using it devotionally. But what struck you this time around, as far as your expectations of teaching Psalms and maybe something else that took you down a slightly different path as you were studying this book?
Sure. I didn't even look to see when we started it, but we're probably into it for more than a year. There we go. There's the noise. Somebody's knocking at the door and the dog's going crazy. I am sorry.
That's okay.
But as far as this time through, my interest in the book was kind of noticing, for a person that would be the king of a nation, it seems kind of interesting that you would think, gosh, when you get to the very pinnacle of being the king of a country, it's got to be a pretty easy thing from there on. You don't have to answer to anyone. But you find that he's a man who's deeply troubled because of so many things that had gone on in his life. But making yourself the king of Israel and one that is careful to do what God has required of you, you're going to take a lot of incoming from the devil. And that means he's going to stir up people and situations. And you see him as a very troubled man, not mentally, but troubled in that everywhere he looks, there's always something. And so that's, I think that's reflected in not only why he says, God, be my shield, all the myriad of things that he talks about, God being his covering. But at the same time, you recognize that he is a man who's deeply dependent on God's provision for everything.
Yeah.
And that was more noticeable this time through than other times.
Very interesting. And I think, too, as we go through life, the longer you're on planet Earth, the more highs and lows you do have. And that the beauty of it is that, we can take from what he learned, and it speaks to all generations. I'm thinking of Psalm 13. And David's really in the pit here. He says, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, and I have sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? But Chris, I notice it's not too many verses later. In fact, just 4 more verses. He says, but I've trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord. He's dealt bountifully with me. That turnaround is pretty quick, isn't it? Because when we find ourselves in that situation, what is he doing first? He's taking counsel in his own soul, which I do not recommend.
Yeah. Well, then you can become so focused on circumstances that you really need to, as he did, kind of come back around to the things that you know to be true.
Yeah.
So what we know to be true has to be the priority rather than taking a look at the circumstances around you. And that's just kind of a truism, spiritually speaking, because everything that we know, think about this, and this happens so often with believers. We forget that everything that we know about our relationship with the Lord is already a settled matter. It's 2,000 years in the rearview mirror.
Right.
So we need to remember that whatever God has promised, whatever we know about him, is really kind of a settled issue. So our circumstances always have to be subject to what we know about him. So David asks a lot, or says a lot of things kind of more rhetorically, only to kind of shake himself and come back to, well, I already know this.
Yeah.
So regardless of how I feel, this is what I know.
Yeah, I love that. Chuck Smith always says, never exchange what you know for what you don't know. And I think that's just one of the best things he ever said. And it gets deeper with David, too, because by the time we're in Psalm, which one is, 32, he says, he's talking about his sin. And it gets very, very heavy there at times. He says, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. Your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was sapped, and then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I didn't cover my iniquity. There is a great pattern for us, and to not take that voice or that conscience, that Holy Spirit, and squelch it and be honest. The honesty here is incredible, and again, it lives for every generation. I think David's transparency is something I just love about Psalms. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, having a pretty well-rounded assessment of yourself is probably a good thing.
Right.
You just recognize that he is simply flesh, and that would be very helpful for any of us to remember when it comes to just who we are in him and who he is primarily is what we have to remember. The thing that we kind of run into once again is somehow thinking that God does this for everyone else but me. I'm a different animal entirely. Right. And so the normal things that we know about him won't work with me. And it's why Jesus coming and dwelling among us helps us to understand that he was tempted in all ways as we were, or we are, but yet without sin. So we can't come to him and say, you don't know what it's like to be me. And he could actually say, well, I actually do, but much better than you.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. Let's look a little bit at the structure of the book of Psalms. There are 5 divisions. Do we know why specifically? I read that Ezra is the one who put them in the 5 divisions. I don't know if that's something you can count on. Do you have thoughts on the 5 divisions and a specific reason for that?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of speculation too, and the fact that you have speculation and you can't actually nail down anything just tells you that there's no good answer to it. So you can kind of look at it for reasons why, but there isn't any real rhyme nor reason to it that I've seen, and so why it was compiled that way, I'm not entirely clear.
Okay, and then the span of time that it took, or that it was written, the various authors, because there are I guess 7 authors is my understanding, because you have David, sons of Korah, Asaph, King Solomon, Moses, Ethan, and a bunch of anonymous that we don't know. How long did it take for those to be written? Is there a time frame on that?
Well, since there are a lot of them that are just not dated, so it's kind of hard to tell. The best that we can think, and again, most people just when you think Book of Psalms, it's all David's personal journal is what people think. But as you said, there's a number of people that had contributed to it. The ones that I was looking at last night give the impression that it was written after they had returned from their captivity in Babylon. So if we figure from David to the return from Babylon, it's basically a 500-year thing. So it could be hundreds of years in its rolling out, if you will. So that's just round figures. Probably 500 years is a pretty good number.
Okay. And every psalm is a song. I don't know if people realize that or not. The first hymnal that the people of Israel had, there are 2,461 total verses, which makes it the longest book of the Bible. There are 400 quotes or allusions in the New Testament to Psalms. Psalm 119 is the longest chapter in the Bible, and if that's a song, Chris, that's a really long opening song. Anybody taking notes out there?
Yeah, they could be sung. There are some of them there. If you remember, there are a group of them that are known as the Psalms or the Songs of Ascent. And if you think about what those would be like, they would be kind of interesting because some of them would be the kind of things that you would want to say or you would be singing if you were going up to the temple. Okay. And a couple of other ones that are just really not quite that way. So it's an interesting thing. What we have to rely on so much is what is put there about who's the person that wrote it, and here's what it was about. But it's not necessarily that it's internal to the psalm. It's what has been sometimes understood traditionally. And so you don't always know exactly what the circumstance was or anything else. So it's why I kind of noticed that there are times that people will almost stand dogmatically on this is about this, or this was about that situation or written at that time. If you can't tell from the internals of it, it's best not to speculate that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of them, if you're going to read Psalms corporately in a church, you look at some of them and you think, I don't know, do we read this in a, because there's rejoicing, there's praise and all that, but then there are some very heavy duty sayings about David talking about his enemies and that sort of thing. I don't know if if they were read also corporately, but some of that's a little bit awkward, I think. But it is a hymnal to me because, and this is my thinking, I'm going to ask you what you think about this. It's a clear description of who God is and a right perspective of who we are in relation to Him. Spirit and truth comes to mind. I wish today's worship in total in the churches would be that. That would be a guideline for modern worship. It's really not. But what are your thoughts on that as far as how the Psalms just fits beautifully into, I think, the traditional definition of worship?
There are many of them that are really, they would be wonderful, or they are wonderful as songs rather, because I can remember so many of the songs that I sang. I'm so sorry. So many of the songs that we sung as far as church was concerned in those early years, is still when I read through them, I think of it, or I read them in the musical sense, and I can actually hear the voice of our worship leader that I remember through all of those years. So it's just kind of an interesting thing when you consider it that way, that they work very, very well. They're incredibly worshipful, but it's because, once again, as we had talked about kind of at the beginning, these are the thoughts and the mind and the heart of the person who's writing them, and they are their observations. And so we're kind of able to sit right next to them and say, amen, I couldn't agree with you more. And that's why I think that they set so well with us, because they're just the pouring out of the heart of the person that's writing.
Yeah. Well, there's that. And even in the psalm that I started with, you are my hiding place, you shall surround me with songs of deliverance. So I was right there with that one, because Maranatha certainly paved the way for a lot of that. And the other one is, he who trusts in the Lord, mercy shall surround him. And so I was already thinking a couple different songs already, and I do the same thing, Chris, when I'm reading a psalm of a song that I already know. I'm right there, and then it's in my head, which is really a wonderful thing to have those stay in your head. Chris, let's talk about types of psalms, and I know that you can easily Google this. There's messianic psalms, and there's something called imprecatory psalms, laments, thanksgiving, ascent, which you mentioned, royal psalms, acrostics, which is very interesting. A group of verses, they would begin with a specific letter of the Hebrew alphabet. A lot of people don't realize that that's in there too. So you have poetry and all these other sort of things. Let's talk about these types of psalms as far as imprecatory. What is an imprecatory psalm? I think that in this Western culture, we don't really know what that means.
I'm so sorry. I keep muting myself because it's just going berserk here with the dog and this person that just won't go away from my front door.
Wow.
Yeah. You have songs that are set up as kind of prayer, and it's the desire of the person to see God interact on their behalf. And that really is a great number of them. But then again, they're because of some particular circumstance that has happened that's created a real difficulty for them. So the various types that you have, there are some that are just completely praise and worship. Others where a person, mostly David, is going through something that is really desperately difficult for him, and he's praying for God's intervention in it. So there are messianic ones, there are prophetic ones that are talking about things that will happen down the road. The acrostic kind of ones that you're talking about, beginning with each letter of the alphabet, of course, Psalm 119. And they all have the common thread is that they're looking towards the Word of God, and it's a way of giving thanks to God for His Word. So, again, you're not going to find just one cookie cutter way of looking at the Psalms. There are so many different parts in the actual book itself, and written for a variety of different reasons. So it's best that this is why I think it's so important for us to know a bit of the history of Israel, because it gives us a better understanding as to what would be the reason why the writer's writing what they are. And it's, again, such an important part of why churches should be understanding the Old Testament timeline, and it really helps to understand why the writer of a psalm would say what they say.
Yeah, in which I think it's in, is it 2 Samuel, the sweet psalmist? David is the sweet psalmist of Israel. That's a great verse that jumped out at me recently. I thought that was just such a neat insight. But yes, you're right. We have to understand the timeline of his life. And if churches aren't teaching the Old Testament or people aren't reading the Old Testament, they're not going to really understand a lot of the context of the Psalms. I mean, is that I understand that a lot of churches just don't even bother with the Old Testament anymore. I'm hoping that's going to turn around again. What are your thoughts on that?
I would love to be wishful and hopeful about that. I kind of have my doubts because I think so much of the reason I've heard why people give for neglecting it is, first of all, because churches by and large teach topical. And one excuse that I've heard is, well, since we're the church, we're looking at a New Testament way of things, not an Old Testament, because it's really not our history. And that's why you'll find that they are okay with Psalms and Proverbs. But once again, if you read through more Psalms than Proverbs, but if you don't know the backstory, if you will, to who's the nation of Israel and why is it such a prominent part of the Psalms, well, because the king by which all of them are measured is the one who wrote the lion's share of them. And so if you don't know anything about his story and where he comes from, none of it's going to make total sense. And I just don't know that the churches have it within them to get in that direction because, well, as you well know, churches kind of get settled into a way that they do things of routine and very seldom look in the mirror and wonder whether or not what they're doing is correct.
Yeah. That is absolutely true. I want to get back a little bit. You talk about David being such a pivotal person in history. And when you said that, it really got my brain going because, even today, the city of David, archaeological site in Israel, one of my absolute favorites. It's been many years since I've seen it. I'm sure it's changed quite a bit. And they're still fighting over who owns Jerusalem and should we give it back and to, I don't know who we would give it back to, but there was in 1997, Israel celebrated 3,000 years since King David captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites. And a lot of this really is what's going on over there. I think this is a no-brainer, Chris. I don't know why the world does not understand that concept, but even in Islam, David is considered an Islamic figure, a king and a prophet of Islam. And so the delusion just gets more absurd. And then they also take out some of the things that David did that were very problematic and sinful because they don't believe kings and prophets do that. So I don't think that's ever going to get cleared over there until Jesus comes back. But what are your thoughts on just the whole scope of history? I know we talked about it briefly at the beginning here, and King David being such an incredible figure. What are your thoughts on all that? Because the archaeology, to me, is an arm of apologetics, and I don't know why people don't get that.
Well, as far as let's just be honest, Islam is a plagiarism of both Judaism and of Christianity. So you've got to try to take from somebody else and try to make your own history out of it. So it's if you look at all the pictures from like the early days of photography and take a look at the pictures of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, you don't see mosques and you don't see all of those kind of things. Right. As far as the Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock, they didn't really care about those places. Islam cared more about Mecca and Medina, and Jerusalem was an afterthought until the Jews wanted to make it their homeland again. And then it got interesting. So none of that should surprise us. The idea that Israel and Jerusalem in particular would become such a focal point, we knew that was going to be the case prophetically. If you're going to try to come along with a new version of a monotheism, and try to introduce that to the world as Muhammad did, you would expect that you're going to have to try to rob from the other monotheism, and that's precisely what he had done. And so the idea that you would claim David as one of yours, I've actually heard them say that those people were actually Muslims themselves, and the only reason that we don't know that is because of the corruption of the text. So he was there to set it straight. Kind of like there's some real interesting parallels with he and Joseph Smith when it comes to those kinds of beliefs.
That's interesting. Wow. I had heard, I don't know if this was in Lebanon or where this was, that a replica, a mosque of the Dome of the Rock was destroyed over the last weekend by the IDF. And somehow I thought that was going to cause, a little more kerfuffle than it did. Of course, it is a mosque, and there's a lot of terrorism that came out of that particular location. Had you heard about that?
No, I had not. I didn't know how close of a replica that there was there in Lebanon, but I hadn't even heard that it had been destroyed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they took it out completely.
Interesting.
Yeah, and nothing came of it that I know of, but I was kind of holding my breath a little bit about that. This is Stand Up for the Truth. My name is Mary Danielson. We are chatting with Pastor Chris Quintana, and we're talking about Psalms. He is sort of just wrapping up his teaching through the Psalms, and what a great book that is for personal meditation, transformation, prayers, poems, prophecies, all of that sort of thing. I want to talk a little bit more, Chris. We just have a couple minutes before the break, but when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about this prophetic Psalms. I think so many are obvious to us who understand the gospel, who are believers, and we're led by the Holy Spirit. I think there are many prophecies in there we may not completely understand at this point, but there are 25, one out of every six verses. One out of every six Psalms. I can't even read my own notes, Chris. Includes at least one messianic prophecy. I thought that was interesting. They have their fulfillment in the New Testament. Some have the clearest connections, as I was saying, and yet there are additional allusions that maybe we don't know. But here are some of the subjects, of course, that are covered in prophetic Psalms: his birth, his nature, his ministry, his betrayal, his resurrection, his exaltation. And I think what I find the most interesting about this is being able to give the gospel strictly from the Old Testament. Say you're talking to a Jew. I had someone on not too long ago about witnessing to the Jews without the New Testament. And I would think the Psalms would be the way that we could do that. Is that something that you ever think of, or maybe you have the opportunity to do that? But I encourage believers to actually understand the gospel just because of what they read in the Psalms. What are your thoughts on prophecy in the Psalms, including the millennial kingdom and so just everything that we are looking forward to?
I absolutely love emphasizing that. You have the triumphal entry told to us, the things that they would be saying when Jesus comes in. Psalm 118, the idea that Jesus is a priest before there was a priesthood is spoken to us, as the Father talks about him as being after the order of Melchizedek. From Genesis 14, that's in Psalm 110. His crucifixion and the reasons for it, Psalm 22. You just have these things that it really only fits one historical figure in human history, and that being Jesus. So these are written hundreds of years, and in fact, from the early ones, basically 1,000 years before Jesus comes onto the scene, he's been spoken about in the book of Psalms. So it's really wonderful for us to be able to say so much of what we know is really a fulfillment of what was told to us in the Old Testament. And I'm reminded of Paul when it tells us after his conversion that he was proving that Jesus was the Christ to the Jews that were there. At Paul's conversion, there wasn't a single book written in the New Testament. So he's able to prove that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel based on the 39 books of the Old Testament. And of course, he would have looked at the book of Psalms for much of that.
Okay. And the Old Testament is the thing that we do have in common with Jews. And if we get the chance to speak to them, conventional wisdom says take the one thing you have in common and try to go from there. And I would love to be able to do that. I have not done that exercise to just presentation of the gospel strictly from the Old Testament and especially the Psalms. I would think that would be a very good exercise for believers. This is Stand Up for the Truth, and we are speaking to Pastor Chris Quintana, oldpaththeology.net, and he is on YouTube, and you can just Google that, Chris Quintana or Old Path Theology, and his teachings will come up. So we're going to talk some more about the Psalms, prophecies in the Psalms when we come back. We'll be back in 2 minutes with Pastor Chris, so stay with us.
Thank you so much for sharing today's Stand Up for the Truth video podcast. We invite you to check out our other headline news site, ctrnn.org. That's ctrnn.org. etrnn.org.
Feedback, questions, and topic suggestions are always appreciated. Email us at comments@standupforthetruth.com.
Welcome back to Stand Up for the Truth for this Tuesday, middle of October. And we have Chris Quintana, oldpaththeology.net. We're talking about the Psalms. And Chris, about your dog. Is everything okay?
Yeah. There's we're having a service done here on some equipment, and they weren't supposed to be here till afternoon.
Oh,
So that's what that was.
Oh,
I had to
okay.
go put her in a downstairs bedroom and shut the door. So
okay. All right. Well, we were hoping during the break here, we were hoping everything was okay, that someone wasn't knocking because there was an emergency of some sort. So.
no, I pretty much knew what it was, but if I'm out of breath, it's because I ran downstairs to run back upstairs and do all of that. So that's what it was about. We're all good now.
Yeah, good. Because usually service people are late; they're hardly ever early. So I don't know. That can be a good thing.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the Book of Psalms today. That Chris is sort of winding up, teaching through that book. Chris Quintana, oldpaththeology.net, and I love. Just talking about David, too, because, when he's in the pit, when he's in the cave, his troubles follow him into the cave because, of course, that is how it works. We take our troubles on the road, cave or otherwise, but when turbulence hit, and if you're in a plane and turbulence hits, you want to go find the pilot and find out what's going on here. And I think David does that well. That's my favorite part about the Psalms is just how God carries him. And boy, do we all need that in this particular time in the universe. Let's wrap up a little bit, Chris, with the prophecies. I downloaded an article that says which Psalms predict the coming of Jesus Christ. And just reading through it, I was so blessed at the subjects. Messiah's birth. He will be from the lineage of David. He will know his father from childhood. He will be called God while still in the womb. A lot of this is Psalm 22. King of the Jews, Son of God, Creator, priest, like you said, the order of Melchizedek, the stone rejected by the builders. Someone posted that on social this morning. That's Psalm 118, as well as Matthew. His ministry, that he will talk in parables, calm the sea, his betrayal, his death. Chris, every single thing is there, and it will take a lifetime, I think, to really understand the beauty of this particular book. But that should build our faith, right, Chris, in these times, because if those prophecies came true, they all will, and we are living in the pages of the books of prophecy. And how does just Psalms alone not only help us witness to people, but it should build our faith?
And this is you had asked what I noticed this time through it, and this is probably the other thing that's right up at the top of that list. And you and I talked about this yesterday. If you think of it from the perspective of the person writing the psalm, whatever it was that they were talking about when they were looking with expectation and hopefulness forward, everything that they could hope for was to them kind of a glimpse. They were looking forward to it, but they didn't really have all the detail because they're looking at things that will be when Jesus comes into the existence. That's when you'll have the fulfillment in its perfection the way that they want, unless it's something that's being spoken about that's even future to our times. We have the ability to say, I can look back historical at what they hoped for because it's something that's already been realized for us. So I've done it this way in a number of the Psalms that I'd want to say, if I could say to David as he reads this, or as he writes this, if I could talk to him, I could say, boy, if you could just see it from my perspective, David, how different it looks. And you can really find that in so many of the Psalms, that it's really exactly that way. The things that they had hoped for and what's being written there, as opposed to how we understand those exact same things, but with so much better information because it's been exposed to us. To them, they hadn't the exposure. It was just shadows. It was glimpses. To us, it's eyes wide open, panoramic.
Wow. And that's part of what you're saying is part of what makes living today so incredible and so much easier to witness because it's already been fulfilled. I've heard 300 prophecies of Jesus in the Old Testament alone. We can't miss the mark here, Chris. We got to be able to, you know what I mean? We should of all people be able to point to his coming and that was fulfilled, and so we can trust him for the rest of prophecy. And yet I still see so many people who are ignorant of scriptures on social media saying, oh, Bible prophecy isn't true, none of it. And I think, you didn't even crack the book, right? Because how can you not see or be shown? How can you not at least be open to being shown these things? And yet people still resist it. I don't get that.
Well, let's pick up on one of the examples of what I was just referring to. Psalm 2. The very first couple of verses. Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth, they set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords. It's prophetic, but only when you can look at it from 2,000 years onward do we understand who Jesus is, and does that make any real sense? So you can read the rest of the psalm and you can say, to them, they could say it's got to be speaking of a personage down the road. We just don't know who it is.
Yeah.
We look at it and say, oh, I can tell you. So, and then you read the rest of the psalm and it makes perfect sense. It explains why the unbelieving world wants so much to dismiss the things that God says and to make it where he has no authority over them. But it's like it says, but he'll hold them in derision. He'll laugh at them. Well, we understand that much better than the person who even penned it. We have a much better understanding than they did.
Yeah. Yeah, people say how much of the Bible is prophecy, and I say, well, where are you? Are you in Genesis 1 or are you in Revelation 20? I mean, it really just depends on your perspective, and we have an incredible perspective.
Yes.
Yeah. And even Psalms, the opening of Psalms is so spectacular, 1 and 2. Don't walk, stand, or sit in the way of the ungodly. It just opens with this great opening shot of how we are to walk and regard sin and the wicked and the ungodly, and then their end in 2. I mean, what a great way to open a book. It's like, you have my attention. Right? And I go ahead.
You had mentioned Psalm 110, so I'll read that. The Lord said to my Lord. So when you look at the original on this, it says, I believe it's Yahweh says to Elohim, I believe. So that it's the Old Testament way of just, you're talking about two deities here that we would just, putting it in very layman's terms. So it says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit here at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. Okay, so book of Hebrews chapter 1, that's pretty much just, it closes that loop. So who are the people that are being focused on here? Who's speaking to whom? To them, it was a mystery. They knew it was someone. It's not David. It's not any king. It's someone who's not even there yet. But David is seeing this conversation between the two of them. We look at it and go, oh yeah, I know exactly who's being spoken of there. And then the book of Hebrews settles it, that as he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, when he had by himself purged our sin, he sat down. The enemies becoming the footstool is, again, found in other places as well, and it's acted out. We understand what it'll look like by Revelation 19. So to us, there's no mystery here. To them, it was very mysterious.
Yeah. That what a great psalm that is. That is oh wow! I read that and I'm in awe. I mean, in so many. I would hope that when people do read the Psalms, what they come away with is just the awe when it comes to God. I have a category, Chris, that you might not see as a header in your Bible, but I call them Psalms for an election year. This is my latest collection because, that's where we should run when we're vexed and we don't understand all the things that are going on in this world are just insane. So I have 2 of them here, Chris, 37 and 73. And what I love about 37, it says, it opens up with, do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of the workers of iniquity. They shall soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb. And so then, verse 3, trust in the Lord and do good. Verse 5, commit your way to the Lord. Verse 7, rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. To me, that is the perfect teaching for what we're going through. And then it ends with, evildoers will be cut off, but those who wait on the Lord shall inherit the earth. That is so comforting to me. And then 73 as well, it talks about the wicked. There's no pangs in their death. They are not in trouble like other men. They're not plagued like other men. They have pride serving as their necklace. They're violent. Their eyes bulge with abundance. They have more than they could ever want. And so David is vexed by this, and he says, when I thought how to understand this, it was too painful for me until I went to the sanctuary of God, and then I understood their end. And so when we're dealing with things that are driving us crazy at this particular point, so close to the election, God's word has the answer: trust, commit, and rest. And I would,
Sure.
I would hope that that's what the church would be committed to while they are doing their civic duty. Do you have any thoughts on this election year? Because I think we're getting so, I know that's a loaded question, but we're getting so close to the end, and then we got to live with the consequences. So what's next, Chris?
Yeah, well, the one that you just read about, considering their end, I hope people really understood what that was. It's basically, if I was to paraphrase it, you look at it and you read that whole thing, and it's Asaph's just going, how do they get away with this stuff?
Right.
When is there going to be some kind of justice for the stuff that these people do? And then I went, and God opened my eyes. I considered their end.
Yeah.
And here, just yesterday, Psalm 146, it tells us, do not put your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help.
Yeah.
His spirit departs, he returns to the earth, and in that very day his plans perish.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the psalm, probably written after they had returned from the Babylonian captivity, is looking at God as the one in whom they should trust. And he goes through a whole series of these things of saying, this is what God does by attribute towards those who love him. And there's a whole litany of them in the two Psalms that I covered yesterday, where it just shows that this is what God desires to do. And for those that are willing and responsive to him and his invitation, he does these wonderful, magnificent things.
Yes. Wow. That's very, very interesting. I just think that we need to be patient with this process, and I know it's hard. I'll admit it. I have a sign in my yard that says "Giant Meteor 2024," and people walk by and they stop because we have cameras in the front. They stop and they just look at it. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what they're saying. And it's not that we don't want to vote or we don't take it seriously, but the process itself will just drive you insane. All these ads that are on all the time, and people hate them. And they spend millions on them, and they don't change anyone's mind. And so it's so ludicrous just starting with all these ads that we have to endure. And I really would hope people would just rest in the Lord during this particular season. It's hard. I know it's hard because there are so many lies. But here we are. And for me, the giant meteor is just, let's just get this over with.
Yeah, and see, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to this, when I look at the two leading candidates, neither one of them, if I was a young person, would I want to say, boy, when I grow up, I want to be just like them.
Yeah. Right.
None of them impress me when it comes to on the personal side of things.
Yeah.
But one of them is going to rule the country. And to me, it's just, for me as an individual, what country would I want to live in?
Yeah.
And I have a pretty good understanding of what's happened over the last 8 years.
Right.
So that's not difficult. But I'm not going to go to either one of them for any kind of theological understanding.
No, you definitely don't want to do that. It'll be over soon, and then we'll just, like I said, we'll live with the consequences of it. It's not the Super Bowl. It has long-lasting effects, so people need to be aware of that. Chris, I want to talk a little bit about creation in Psalms, because I learned between Job and Psalms, I learned an awful lot of just neat things. And Psalm 8 says, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you've ordained. And then he cuts to the chase. What is man that you're mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you visit him. You've made him a little lower than the angels and crowned him with glory and honor. And then Psalm 19, which is my favorite. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech. Night unto night reveals knowledge. It's just, and God has to humble himself to look into his creation. Chris, what a great book to learn the basic ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of the picture book of our world that we live in.
Right. And you've hit on one of my very favorites. And it's in the last couple of weeks, I went through it where he almost says the exact same things. But every one of us has probably been at some point where we will consider the vastness of God's creation. And once again, our ability to look at the creation as opposed to what David could have looked at versus what we know about the expanse of the universe and the design of the human body and of all of the intricacies of the creation. What our knowledge is so far surpasses his, and yet we would come to the same conclusion. And probably even more so now from our perspective, because we understand the creative genius of it. who is man that you even pay attention?
Yeah.
And add another layer to it. Well, who is man that you pay attention? You sent your son to die for man.
Yeah.
So I have even more than David could have ever even considered to just go, why do you care?
Yeah.
And if ever somebody would wonder whether or not God cares about them, which is, again, one of the things that the devil will try to tell people, God doesn't care about you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're just one of 8 billion people, and look at all the suffering that there is on the planet. Of course, you don't matter. That's what the devil would have us to believe. But if we look at what David says and repeat that based on what we know, it makes him so much, it makes him grander than we could have ever imagined when we stop to think about the one who doesn't need us, went to extraordinary lengths to redeem us that we could be with him eternally.
Mm-hmm. And you think about Moses and David, and they didn't have a lot of city light pollution. When they looked up, they saw things that, differently than we do. We live in the city. There are lights everywhere. Even when you go stay somewhere in a motel on the ocean or whatever, there's still light pollution everywhere. I would love to see what they saw as far as the vastness of space. I don't know if they saw northern lights or not. I'm still waiting to see those in my lifetime, but just looking up for them would have been incredibly awe-inspiring. And then we get Psalm 139, and we take it to an even closer level. You have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up, and understand thoughts from afar off, my path, my lying down. There isn't a word on my tongue, but you know it all together. So now we've gone from this vast expanse of the universe to the little, the dividing of our cells in our mother's womb. It's just a phenomenal revelation here, that people today don't even know what a woman is, and they don't even know when life begins. But here we have Psalm 139.
Yeah, there are a number of them that I've gone through in just these last several weeks, and you just mentioned the one of Psalm 139. They didn't have any problem with recognizing the world around them and just realizing that there's a God who creates and designs and makes things. And it just defies explanation.
Mm-hmm.
It's why I think, once again, I know that I don't want to be too repetitious, but what we look at with the knowledge that we have should just make us go to the point of, oh, I need to have the same kind of basic trust that they do. And right now, if they could speak, they would say, oh, wait till you see what we're seeing right now. So I guess that it all comes full circle.
It does.
They didn't know the half of what we know, but now where they are, we don't know the half of what they know now. So we're playing catch up now.
That's
when it
pretty
comes to that.
profound. That's pretty profound, Chris.
Yeah.
We have electron microscopes, right? We can see little viruses and have fun with those and delude people with virus information. So, yeah, knowledge will increase. That's all I can think of. I was reading something a couple years ago. It was some prose written by an unsaved person. I happen to like this author. And a specific portion jumped out at me that made me put it down and just think about what she was thinking, because Psalm 19 is my favorite psalm. This author said she loved to stare at the night sky. It's lovely and it's calming. And then she said something that really got my attention. She said, I don't really understand what I'm seeing. It's like some language I don't understand. Now, even when I was a little kid, I saw the heavens as the work of God. But for some, it seems like they have a veil in place, Chris, that they're just stars and moon. It's just so romantic, but they aren't really thinking it through. So someone who doesn't acknowledge God's glory, but thinking that it is a language that she cannot translate. And then I look at Psalm 19, it says, there's no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Everybody knows. And I'm just fascinated that someone would say, I can't decode this.
Right. Well, there's what's the old saying? It's kind of proverbial now, but it's there's none so blind as those who refuse to see.
Yeah.
So you can see everything, but yet you will you'll hide your understanding from what you see.
Yeah.
To think that it's just some random thing. Again, I guess it's because we come from the perspective that God is the one who told us how he did what he did.
Mm-hmm.
David would have been much more familiar with that. Let's be honest. A person like David didn't have the same kind of distractions that we do, and none of them did. Even in the founding of our own country, there was no internet, there was no television, there was no radio, there was nothing else. You're just kind of captive to your thoughts. And if you can walk outside, like you say, no light pollution, and you can just take a look at the creation of things, you're more captive to your thoughts than at any time. I think that we don't have any real understanding of it in our modern
Yeah.
times. So yeah, it gives you that ability to just kind of take it all in. And God has already demonstrated himself to David and the people like that in the nation of Israel, because he's done so many miraculous things that are just part of their history.
Yeah.
So everything having a context makes it that much easier to understand.
Yeah. Yeah. It really does. And I think my favorite thing about Psalm 19 is it talks about in the first half up through verse 6, it talks about the son going out like a bridegroom. So there's a little personification going on here. It gets my imagination going. And it's this picture book that we should all be able to go out, like Romans says, we should see creation and we should know that there is a God. And so there's this picture book, this elementary school for little kids. Here's the picture book. But the second part is the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord, the statutes of the Lord. There's your book, too, for those who graduate from picture books, and they're able to say, yes, there is a God. And now they're going to the written word, which is for someone who wants to dig a little bit deeper. And that is what I love about Psalm 19. It just, to me, it's the whole revelation that's out there. And like I said, then we have Romans where God says, hey, you should know better. Quit worshiping the creature. You should know that there is a creator. But we're getting deeper and deeper into the whole climate change and all that nonsense, Chris. So clearly no one has learned a thing from their picture books.
Well, yeah, of course. And again, here's one of those things, looking at it from the perspective of history, wherever you are.
Mm-hmm.
When I see David saying the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul, I look back at the law and say, I don't feel that sure, it's beautiful, it's perfect because it's what God gave, but it doesn't, to me, it's a condemnation, because it shows me that I'm a sinner and there's no remedy in the law. The law can only cover it for a time. So if you could speak to the law, if the law had a person, you would say, so when's this all going to be over? And when can I actually have a remedy for my sin? The law would be able to say, I can't help you with that. And then it would point me to Jesus, like Paul talks about in Galatians. So when I see David saying those things, it's again, oh, if only I could tell you what I know.
Yeah.
Talking to the David of 3,000 years ago, now he lives it. He knows it because he's been face to face with his descendant who saved his soul.
Yeah. Wow, that's a great perspective, because as you're talking there, I'm looking at, the fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, than much fine gold, sweeter than honey and the honeycomb. That's only after you really, really understand who you are and who he is. Those are just incredible, incredible verses. And then he says, cleanse me from secret faults and keep your servant from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. So to me, this is the whole package. Psalm 19 is the whole package. I'm very biased towards it. I can't help myself. That's just the way it is. So we only have 2 more minutes, Chris, and I know there's so much more we could say about Psalms, just the way the names of God in the Psalms. Now, there's a Bible study by itself, how we learn more and more about him, just from the names that he gives himself in the Psalms. What is your favorite Psalm? Before we go, I got to ask you, do you have a favorite Psalm? We only have a minute left.
Oh, I genuinely don't. It's little bits out of each. I shared one with you before the show started. Let me go ahead and end with that. It's in Psalm 147, and it helps us to understand the nature of God and who he is and how he does what he does. This is the writer of the Psalm. We don't know who it is. Psalm 147 is written very, very late in their history. And it says, speaking of God, he declares his word to Jacob and his statutes and his judgments to Israel. It's just a way of saying he's communicated to the nation. And he has he has not dealt thusly with any other nation. And as for his judgments, they have not known them. So no other nations have understood those things. Wow. So God has only communicated himself at the time of the writing of the book of Psalms to one people and one people only, and then it was made known to the world. Wow. We can look back at ourselves and say, we're not a nation genetically, and we are not a nation as far as the terra firma. But here's what we are. We are another group of people that God has indeed communicated to, Jew and Gentile alike, to all those who are in this world. They have been communicated to. God has broadened that.
Wow. Great and significant insight, Chris. We could probably spend another hour on that. Thank you so much for being with me today. I hope people got something out of this study in the book of Psalms. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
Tomorrow, a special encore presentation of Understanding the Times with Jan Markell at 9 Central Time. No replay podcast tomorrow, so that's what's going on. Also, Pete Garcia on Thursday, David Bowen on Friday. So much to talk about. Thanks for being with me. Join me again live on Thursday.